you guys have probably already heard, so Gunter Fischer has been gracious enough to come and give us a talk. He is a vice president here at the Mobot Botanical Gardens, a longtime orchid keeper, and he's going to talk specifically about today Malagasy orchids and a little bit on their program that you guys are doing out there of a lot of preservation in there. He did send me this information, and we tried to send this out through the newsletter. We're not sure how much of that actually got out in the process, so we'll double check, but there is a larger paper that they've written that talks about the Africa process itself as well as the Malagasy program. So there's a couple of copies up here if you guys would like to take a look at it. But I definitely want to thank Gunter and his wife Petra for coming out and giving us the talk today. So you'll
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and talk about the program. I guess I'm going to position myself here so that you can see the screen. I just want to say orchids are my passion. From when I was 6 years old, I got my first orchid, and I basically turned my passion for orchids into a profession. And I was working on orchids now for over 20 years. As a researcher, describing new species, understanding diversity of orchids all around the world, but I also moved into sort of other themes at the garden here, looking after restoration and conservation of entire ecosystems and documenting plant diversity around the world. Today I'm going to talk about Madagascar. Madagascar is an island, and I want to start with some facts about Madagascar. Where is Madagascar? What kind of vegetation? Then I will talk a little bit about the garden's programs in Madagascar, and then I'll introduce different vegetation types and the corresponding orchids. Maybe I start with a question. Who has got an orchid from Madagascar? Angrecums? Bulbophyllums? So yes, so you're going to see a lot of information around this today. So to start with, Madagascar is sort of off the east coast of Africa. It's an island. It's the fourth largest island in the world. It has about 230,000 square miles in size, and it's considered one of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet. There are not many places around the world which have such a diverse flora than Madagascar. And that's why the garden is active in Madagascar for over 40 years now. And Madagascar is interesting because it's very diverse in terms of elevation, and so basically in the center of Madagascar, the spine is mountainous, so there is elevations up to 6,500 feet, and also geology is very diverse. And so the combination of really a lot of different elevations, different geology, and then of different sort of humidities and rainfall patterns gives you a very diverse mix of different vegetation types. And each vegetation type has different orchids. And so the way how it looks like now is a lot of the humid air from the ocean is blown against the main mountain range. So basically the eastern side of Madagascar is humid and moist. So you get really rainforest and sort of very sort of moist and really soaking forests, cloud forests even. Whereas the western side is really dry. So in the southwestern bit here, you actually find almost desert type vegetation. So you get from humid tropical rainforest everything to desert. And obviously that triggers a very, very diverse mix of different plant species. Madagascar also has cyclones, very similar to hurricanes, and they hit the east coast and have a significant impact on the vegetation. So the trees are shorter because of this, because of strong wind, and there's a lot of tree fall patterns, so the entire vegetation is adapted to this. Also important to understand is that Madagascar is not really densely populated, about 30 million people, but it's a very rural community, and they're scattered across the entire island. And unfortunately, only less than 5% of the original vegetation is left. So Madagascar is really under threat at the moment, and conservation in Madagascar is more important than ever. And I will talk more about this a little bit later. So as I said, Malagasy forests are disappearing, unfortunately. So there are different causes, human-caused issues, also natural issues. Forests are cleared for agriculture or for mining and all kinds of extractions of different goods. And this is how the forests end up. And the problem is also for the orchids, once the trees are gone, you have no more orchids because most of the orchids sit on the trees as epiphytes. And so basically the loss of the forest means also loss of the orchids. The forest can actually grow back in some cases, but the orchids are not coming back that easily. That's why it's so important to have orchid conservation programs. This is how it looks like. It's very steep slopes. I mean, there are people here trying to grow dry rice on the land. And the problem is you burn it once, and then you have a little bit of ash as fertilizer to grow crops, but after 2 or 3 years, the soil is exhausted, and you have to move on to the next plot. And so gradually, if you do this over more than 1,000, 2,000 years, then the vegetation disappears on a very large scale. The consequences are also droughts, because the forest provides the humidity and the cloud cover. And if it's insufficient rain, you get massive droughts now in Madagascar, especially in the south. And damage from cyclones is also an issue for biodiversity loss. So it's very unfortunate. And if the forest is gone, there's still heavy rainfall in certain parts, and then entire mountains are washed away. So this is basically soil erosion, what you see here. Entire slope of mountain has been washed away, causing erosion. And then the big rivers are colored in red because of the soil washed down into the river. So this is a river system here, and the red color comes from soil erosion. So it's a huge environmental issue, and the garden has decided many years ago, almost 45 years ago now, that conservation program, research and conservation program was launched. Just a few information about Malagasy people. Language in Madagascar is Malagasy, it's a local language, and French. It's based on the colonial history. About 500 to 700 AD, Madagascar was colonized. So actually it's not that long colonized. People are not living that long on Madagascar. So it's very unfortunate that the balance between humans and nature was not really established, and therefore gradually vegetation is lost, and by now it's only 5%. There's lots of different ethnic groups in Madagascar. It's culturally very interesting, and I just could recommend, if you can and want to, Madagascar is really worth a trip. It's really beautiful. On the countryside and the highlands, houses are made out of bricks. But you can see, I mean, ox cars are very commonly used as a vehicle for transport. So it's very rural, simple communities. And Madagascar is not wealthy. I mean, people are not wealthy in Madagascar. So it's one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. But people are happy on the countryside. I mean, it's really fascinating. Our programs in Madagascar, really friendly people, very welcoming. On the east coast, where it's more humid, the houses are made out of bamboo and have cover with palm leaves. And so people live off the land from agriculture mostly. What's really special about Madagascar is also wildlife. I don't know whether you have seen the lemurs in the zoo. Really special, only found in Madagascar. There's about 200 species, I think, of lemurs, and 90% of them, no, 100 species, sorry, 100 species. About 90% of them are endemic. And there's a lot of other interesting wildlife as well. Yeah, over 100 different lemur species. This is an Indri, which is the largest lemur. It's about this size. It's quite large. It's actually amazing when you camp in the forest and in the morning they are singing. And so it's just an unforgettable experience waking up in the middle of the forest hearing the Indri singing. This is a mouse lemur on the right. It's very tiny. They can be up to just a couple of inches. So it's really a huge diversity also in terms of primates. And this is a sifaka, which is also a larger bodied lemur. So very different species of lemurs. There's another mouse lemur, which is, I think, most of the time nocturnal. And so basically you get lemurs which are active during the day, and other lemurs are active during the night. Also very interested, a lot of people who like geckos. They like leaf-tailed geckos also as pets. They're also endangered like any other wildlife, so it's very important if people are into pets, then that they're sort of artificially breeded or individuals and not taken from the wild. 200 species of chameleons. I mean, there are chameleons which are just that tiny, like the one there, and others can be like almost like 2 foot or more. Usually they're friendly, but yeah, gorgeous animals. What's really interesting and special about Madagascar, there are no venomous snakes. So there are some boars, there's about 80 different species of snakes. So really going to the jungle is not particularly dangerous because there are hardly any poisonous or venomous animals. And so that makes botanical exploration easier and not as sort of, you know, in some other places where you have lots of venomous snakes, I mean, it's kind of a challenge. Or I've been also working in Uganda in Africa and in restoration. It was grass like 3 meters tall. And someone was saying, well, be careful, sometimes lions are coming up this way. And so it's like, yeah, Madagascar doesn't have any of this. So it's a very nice place to be. Just briefly about Madagascar's plant diversity, it's super diverse. It's 14,000 different plant species. As a comparison, the US has about 17,000, but it's an entire continent almost, whereas Madagascar is a small island. So it's really, really rich. It's about 1,100 orchid species. So that's also quite on the top of the list. And we find new species all the time. So this is just a glimpse of what's there. And every other trip, expedition our team is doing, we find new species. And only over 90% are actually only found in Madagascar. You can't find them elsewhere.
That's of the orchids? 90% of the orchids or 90% of...
Both. So now, it was an overview about Madagascar, and now I want to talk a little bit about the gardens program in Madagascar. So the first trips to Madagascar by garden staff were in the 1970s. And about 1987, the garden established a permanent office in Madagascar, which you can see on the right. So we have an office, and by now, we have about 275 local Malagasy staff working for the garden in Madagascar. It's a really large program. And we have also one expert in Madagascar, and it's a multi-dimensional research and conservation program, which I'm going to introduce. So the entire program started with botanical research and conservation. I guess some of you probably have known or heard about Peter Raven, who was the previous president of the garden. He started the program, and he said, Madagascar is a biodiversity hotspot. We need to explore what kind of plants are found on that island. And so ever since, about 185,000 botanical specimens were collected by the garden in Madagascar, and experts in different plant groups identify those. We have described about 800 new species to science since the program was started. I mean, it's really remarkable. When you think about 14,000 plant species, about very close to 1,000 have been described by the garden staff over that period. Also very important because deforestation is such a big issue, a lot of the garden scientists are busy to assess the conservation status of the species, because it's very important to know which tree species, for example, is common and which one is endangered. And so there's a lot of effort going into assessments to make sure that the endangered species are part of conservation programs to make sure that they don't go extinct. And as you can see here, I mean, some of these expeditions are really difficult. The car got stuck, the oxes had to pull the car out. Sometimes it's days and days of walking to reach the field sites because of the deforestation, there is no more forest next to roads. Sometimes it's days and days of hikes to actually reach the last remaining forests. Then you have to camp out, and life in the forest is fairly simple. So what's very interesting, about 25 years ago, the garden decided to take on land for conservation. So at the moment, the garden manages 11 protected areas in Madagascar, with total area about 160,000 acres. And the sites were selected especially because of their botanical diversity. Because usually conservation organizations focusing on animals, lemurs and geckos and frogs and whatnot, but hardly anyone focuses on plants. But then plants are the basis for all life. And so obviously, we want to make sure that plants don't go extinct, and so that's why the garden at the time took on the management of protected areas. And it sounds strange. Why would a US organization manage land in Madagascar? We're actually not managing it by ourselves. It's in partnership with local communities. And so it's a community-based conservation approach. And the idea is really to empower local Malagasy people to look after their own natural heritage. And it's sort of a really community-driven approach because we build capacity, we educate, and then hopefully next generation of people look after their heritage in a different way compared to the past. And so our teams are embedded in the different communities, they're community facilitators, and it's one of the most successful conservation programs in Madagascar by now. And the Malagasy government is really, really happy to have us as partner because it's so important to include the local communities because obviously you have to get the buy-in of the local people to make sure that the sites persist. Because of the massive amount of deforestation, it's also important to bring back the forest. And so the garden by now is one of the largest players in Madagascar to restore forests. So we have about 25 tree nurseries at the moment, which produce about 500,000 trees a year for reforestation efforts. And again, it's a community-based approach where the garden collaborates with local communities which plant out the trees as well as propagating the trees. And it also creates local jobs because international foundations fund the reforestation. It's for carbon capture. And it creates a lot of jobs for local communities, and they're really happy to be part of the program. We also have some focused species conservation efforts, not only for orchids, but also for trees and other plant species. And as an example here, that particular tree species, there's only 8 individuals left. So when the garden discovered it and described it as a new species a couple of years ago, we found it, and right away it was classified as being critically endangered and almost close to extinction. But conservation efforts, we were able to collect seeds, and the tree has been propagated, and now in a protected area, 64 plants of that tree are growing, and there is progress also to get more individuals planted elsewhere. So literally that species was saved from extinction by the Gardens program in Madagascar. Now, orchid conservation. As I mentioned, orchids grow mostly on trees in Madagascar, and when the trees disappear, the orchids disappear too. At the moment, there's about 1,100 orchid species known in Madagascar. About 300 of them have been assessed for conservation, and unfortunately, the majority are actually threatened by extinction because of the deforestation. And I have to say, when this is extrapolated to the total number, about 300 orchid species probably are critically endangered in Madagascar. And it's not just because of habitat destruction. I have to really say, it's also for the illegal trade in orchids. Especially during COVID, eBay and all kinds of platforms were selling orchids fairly cheaply, and many of them were actually taken from the wild. And we could see that even in the protected area the garden is involved, people were walking in and stealing the orchids. And then apparently they appeared later on some online platforms. So I think it's very important when growing orchids to make sure that they are really from reliable sources and being propagated. There is no need to cultivate plants taken from the wild, because any of the orchids in Madagascar can be propagated fairly easily. So yeah, I forgot to mention, so when I started in Madagascar around 2000, in 2004, the first shade house, I was involved to build this, and it was interesting because at the time I was working at the University of Vienna in Austria, my home country, and at some point the University of Vienna couldn't afford it anymore, and they handed it over to the Missouri Botanical Garden. And then when I started the garden 3 years ago, the colleague who ran the program in Madagascar said, "Hey, here is your shade house, back to you," which was really great. And yeah, so my early days, my colleague in Madagascar, Shaki, and so this is the ex situ conservation collection in the Botanic Garden in Madagascar. And the plants are grown for flowers, for identification. The flowers get put in alcohol for preservation, and then scientists are identifying them and describing as new species if they are. Also, the plants are used for propagation. You can see I was a little bit younger by then. And so, yeah, I was working actually over 10 years in Madagascar, my early part of my career. And diversity of orchids is mind-blowing. And the colors and forms and shapes of orchids is just mind-blowing. So the garden by now runs about 6 shade houses, similar to the ones you've seen. We have about 10,000 plants in cultivation. 6,000 flower samples are preserved in alcohol and for DNA analysis. More than 10,000 photos were taken of all the collections. And about 600 species have been identified so far. Given that there's more than 1,000 species, about 50% have been rediscovered. So there's still more work to do. And as I said, a lot of new species are discovered every year. And the different shade houses in different parts look very different. I mean, very often, especially if they're close to natural areas, just simple structures with bamboo and palm leaves for shade. And the orchids are grown then by local communities for research purposes. We also had established micropropagation in Madagascar to be able to propagate the orchids to make sure that they don't go extinct. And we also have done reintroduction programs for certain species. For example, there is one Angrecum, which is called Angrecum longicalca. It has a very long spur like this. It's very unique, but there's only 20 or 30 plants, something like this, left in the wild. But as a conservation program, together with Kew Gardens, actually, about 150 were reintroduced to the site to make sure that the species don't go extinct. And by now, also, some of the propagated plants have been planted by local communities in their backyards. And so basically, the population in the landscape has been increased. Right, so a lot about the garden, a lot about Madagascar. Now I'm going to show you a little bit about orchids and orchid diversity. I will start off with the humid part of Madagascar. It's so basically the eastern coastal area and the lower mountains, and also that part up here are humid and have a very high rainfall. In some areas up to 5,000 millimeters. And diversity is mind-blowing. Obviously, some of the key genera in Madagascar, Angrecums, Barbophyllums, Arangis, and then there are also some interesting leafless orchids like this Microcylia. And we got a Chilochista here, but so the Madagascar also got this sort of leafless types, and they come in all colors as well. So the coast of Madagascar is completely unspoiled. Jungle all the way up to the sea in some places. Beautiful beaches. Petra came with me a couple of times, and you basically have beautiful beaches for yourself. I mean, there is no one there, and forest goes in some places right up to the coast, and branches of old trees are covered in orchids. So these are Barbophyllums above seawater. I mean, in storms, they actually get splashed by salt water, but they seem not to mind. And you can see, even at sea level, humidity is so high that you get thick layers of moss on the trees. Lots of mangroves, and usually mangroves are a very good spot for a number of different orchid species. These are rocks in the mangroves. There's cushions of moss and then tiny Barbophyllums sitting on top. Also, the swamp forests in Madagascar, coastal forests, are the home of Angrecum sesquipetale. This is sort of one of the largest orchid flowers in the world. I mean, the flower itself can be up to this size, and the spur can be up to, well, I would say at least 2 to 3 foot. So again, me a little bit younger at the time, but it was really remarkable to see different shapes and sizes of Angrecum sesquipetale in the wild. That species is actually fairly easy to cultivate, and it's readily available in the trade, and you get large flower clones also in cultivation. So this is fairly easy to grow, and I would think, given the climate in St. Louis in summer, this would be happy outdoors during the warm summer months, and it just needs indoor conditions during the winter. In that coastal area, there are also sort of lots of other different species, like Barbophyllums, really unusual flowers like this. This is the flower of a Barbophyllum. I mean, it doesn't really look like an orchid in a way, but golden in color, which is very unusual for Barbophyllums, because usually Barbophyllums are sort of more fly attractive and have rather funny smells. The forest here goes right away up to the coast. We would explore with canoes the coastal forest for orchids. Very often we were camping along the beach. I mean, one has to be a little bit adventurous for some of these things because there are no hotels, and so one has to be happy with camping. The road conditions are a bit rough, I have to say. So I had to say, I got out of the car. I wasn't willing to drive with over those bridges, but we made it. And also sort of more inland road conditions are really difficult. So it's really expedition type work. Usually we would always do botanical exploration, not just for orchids, but also any plant. Everything what we found in flower got pressed, an herbarium specimen was made, and the plants got shipped for identification to different experts around the world, including the garden here, of course. I think he's having a bottle of wine here. I haven't noticed that before. But he was the driver. That's actually concerning. Probably that's why he mastered the bridge so well. Also, lots of rivers inland, and so basically it's on foot, it's on boats to reach remote places, and larger boats first, smaller canoes later, and then basically it's up to hiking. In many remote places, it's like several days hikes, and so we had porters and to reach remote areas. Dense jungle in many places, and it's teeming of orchids. So basically, you can have trees where you can find 50 different orchids on one tree. It's mind-blowing. Really dense, beautiful vegetation. I mean, yes?
How are the bugs?
Well, actually, the bugs are not too bad. Madagascar is not a problem in terms of mosquitoes. There are mosquitoes in the lowlands, especially near human settlements. One has to be careful with malaria and some other mosquito-borne diseases. But in the forest, actually, mosquitoes are not that common. But what you have here are leeches. So you get a little bit drained of blood, but it's not, you know, it's okay. Yeah.
Just the boa constrictors?
That's how it looks like life in the forest, and usually the plants are dried over the fire. So there are different ways of preserving plants. Either you put alcohol over them, but then all the specimens turn black. Whereas if you smoke them and dry them over the fire, it's also okay. But some of the humid places is actually very difficult to dry plants. So this is, for example, a camp in the jungle where we stayed several nights. And then now the orchids. So I just will sort of flip through this a little bit, like a slideshow. Many different color forms and shapes of different genera. So I start here with Barbophyllum. That's a very spectacular Barbophyllum. It's called Barbophyllum alexandrae. Flower spike is this tall. But you can see, I mean, this is sort of really growing in thick moss, and the moss hangs from the trees. So it's sort of cloud forest environment, very similar to the Andes, for example, where you have Masdevallias or Lepanthes. So they like similar kind of conditions. In the forest, it was always nice with the local guys, basically camping out, and in the evening having a chat. And all of them actually were always interested in learning more about their natural heritage and the plants and the wildlife. So
are you speaking French with them, or Malagasy? What are you?
Well, the colleague, so we always go in the field with local colleagues. The garden has a lot of local staff, so they would either translate, because really in rural areas, people wouldn't even speak French. So they speak Malgache, which is something, it's hard to learn. So that's cloud forest. For example, here is a begonia sitting on a tree, several begonias here. And it's sort of that humid environment, a lot of orchids can be found. It's interesting that the type of Barbophyllum was described from Madagascar in the 18th century. And I show you a picture later of the type. It doesn't look like any of the Asian bulbophyllums. So it's interesting how different bulbophyllum can be. That's also a very distinct type of bulbophyllum. Or this one. This is beautiful. It's tiny flowers, a bit like a Masdevallia. Another bulbophyllum. So bulbophyllums, there's about 350 species in Madagascar. They come in all colors, forms, and shapes. Another bulbophyllum. This is also very unusual. So the appendages on the lip are actually movable. They move in the wind, very similar to some African species. A few more bulbophyllums. I have to say bulbophyllum is my main expertise. Maybe that's why there are so many bulbophyllums here. This is very unusual. I mean, this is the flower spike here. And it looks like almost Araceae. I mean, there's, when you look at anthuriums and things like this, they almost have a similar kind of flower. I mean, it's just amazing. Arangis is an important family in Madagascar, genus in Madagascar. There's lots of species. Angraecums, some more unusual ones, small. Some of the Angraecums are just a few centimeters, really miniature orchids. Lots of terrestrial species, like sign orchids, are found in the understory of rainforests. This is also interesting, Grammangis. It's another genus. Sometimes you can see this at orchid shows, and it's available in the trade. And so this is overall the impression of humid forests on the eastern coast of Madagascar. It's almost raining every day. And in terms of cultivation, so montane species are very similar to cultivate, like Masdevallias or Dendrobiums from Papua New Guinea, like Cuthbertsonii. So humidity about 70–80% during the day. Very important for many montane species, and I think this is generally the case. They like lower temperatures at night. So, and it's when you are out in the forest and you camp there, you can feel during the day temperatures go up to 75 maybe, but at night they drop to 60 or below 60 to 55 or something. And so many of these montane species need that kind of temperature difference, which is very hard when you just grow them indoors. In a greenhouse, for example, it's easier, especially during winter times. Coastal species need, like Angraecum sesquipetale, they are fine with warm temperatures all year round. And lower temperatures at night are not that common actually at the coastal areas. It cools down a little bit, but not so much compared to the montane forests. Now I want to talk a little bit about the high plateau. This is about vegetations up to 6,000 feet. And what's very special about Madagascar are those rocky outcrops. They are called Inselbergs. And they're found all over the world. For example, in Brazil, you have also Inselbergs, and they're very famous for the rubiculous lalias, the small lalias which grow on the rocks. And it's a very similar kind of habitat. And there's a set of Angraecums, for example, which grow in that kind of habitat. Also very often, you have the rocky outcrops, but in between the rocky outcrops are pockets of forest. So the central plateau is really a mix of vegetation types, from grassland with short vegetation, like you can see here, to rocky outcrops and humid forests. And I was camping out there, and very often in the morning there was ice on the ponds. So night temperatures can drop really dramatically. So there was our camp. And what's very...
Any of the higher elevations get snow?
No snow, no snow. It's just very mild frost in the winter season, which is our summer. On the shale granites, you get very shallow soil, and in this area trees can't grow, but this is where you find a lot of terrestrial orchids and also Angraecoids. So Madagascar also has Daisa, which I think many people know Daisa uniflora from South Africa with a big red flower. Madagascar got lots of different Daisa species. The color is mind-blowing. There's another genus called Satyrium. And what's very special about Madagascar, many orchids have a spur, and so they're all pollinated by moths. And Madagascar is a center of moth pollination. Habenarias, very common in grasslands. Cynorchis gibosa, it's a beautiful, actually fairly large flowered species. Another Dyser here in orange, Didomoplexis. And this is how many orchids grow. So this is also very moist in many places because granite water can't go through, and so there are depressions which fill up with water, and there's a lot of carnivorous plants as well, like you can see at Drosera and similar species. And then on the shale granite, you find angrecoids. So this is Arangus cryptodon, which can grow up to this height. It's amazing, and flower spikes can be up to several feet long. And they sit in between the rocks and the shrubby vegetation, the cracks between the open rock surfaces. The rock surfaces during the day can really heat up and get really hot. You hardly can touch them. And if night temperatures drop very much, the rocks buffer some of the cold night temperatures. Beautiful flowers of Arangus cryptodon. This is also a species which is very sought after by many people, Angrecum magdalene. Very large flower, also flower really this size. Again, those are really cool growing species. So one has to be really careful when growing Angrecums to really know where they come from, because Angrecum esquivita likes it warm, it's from the coast, but many of the other species like these, they really like it cold. And they sit basically in humus pockets in between the rocks. In little sort of stunted forest in between the rocks, you find all kinds of other interesting orchid species. Polystachya is another genus which is very common there, but also unusual things like Neobatia, which is also sort of out of the Angrecoid group. Just one of the trips, we discovered that Humilea species, which is new to science. It hasn't been described yet. It's very close to a species, but it's definitely a new one. So every time you go to a place in Madagascar where no one has collected, you find new species. It's amazing. So many trees are covered at this high altitude in lichens. And this is the type species of the genus Barbophyllum. It's called Barbophyllum nutans. It's a creeping thing with rather not very attractive flowers. This is sort of the classical orchid from Madagascar. It's called Lemur Orchids madagascariensis. So I think this is the orchid of Madagascar. It's not particularly spectacular, but the name is really from Madagascar. Calanthe sylvatica or Calanthe madagascariensis. Some people, there's not, some scientists are not clear about whether this is a separate species in Madagascar or not, but it's very similar to Asian Calanthes. So that's actually interesting that when you say 90% are only found in Madagascar, the other 10% are either coming from Africa, but there are also species coming from Asia. So Madagascar is a bit of a mixture of everything. Unusual Barbophyllums again, also in the highlands. And then different types of Angrecoids, very often with very long spurs. Arangis modesta is really something spectacular. These things are also available in the trade. I mean, I'm sure some of the orchid nurseries have them in stock. And I think important really, as I mentioned before, is to look for propagated plants, from seeds and not wild collected material. Arantes is another genus which is very common in many different species in Madagascar, also often very spectacular. Another Barbophyllum. What's also very interesting about Angrecums in Madagascar, there's some very large species, but then there was a lot of miniature ones. So this is Angrecum rutenbergianum. This is only this size. And the flower is twice the size of the plant. So there's a lot of interesting miniature orchids in the Angrecum alliance. Another one, Angrecum urchianum, for example, is also a very collectible one. And whenever you get rocky outcrops, you get also succulents. Madagascar is very famous for all kinds of succulents, from Bacchibodiums and euphorbias. So there's a lot of interesting succulent species on rocky outcrops. For example, that Angrecum rutenbergianum is a tiny miniature orchid, and it sits with succulents in cracks in rocks. Very similar, like you would see certain Laelia species, let's say, in Brazil. Some barbophyllums, like Laelias, grow on rocks in full sunshine. And this is sort of the issue when looking at cultivating highland species. So everything which grows on rocky outcrops, like these rubiculous Laelias, they need strong sunshine. And so they would not grow well under low light conditions, and they tend to rot very easily. But if you know where they come from and what type of habitat they naturally occur, it's fairly easy to translate this into cultivation conditions. So all these highland species need high humidity and do much better if they have cooler nights. So you have to have a temperature drop at night to cultivate them nicely. All right, last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about the western side of Madagascar. And as these photos already show here, it's dry. And trees have bottle trunks to store water. And baobabs, for example, I mean, are very famous. This is a baobab. And all kinds of other really unusual dry forest species. And so the landscapes are very wide and open, shrubby vegetation in many parts, some rocky outcrops of interesting orchids, and usually you find this kind of dry forest. In Madagascar, they call it spiny forest, because there are some endemic plant families. They look like, I don't know how you describe this, but it's sort of like, you know, I don't know, like a grass, but it's really big trees, and they're very succulent. And lemurs jump from one to the other, and what's very sort of striking is many of these dry forest species have long spines, and it's really actually hostile. I just don't know how these lemurs manage this, that they can jump from one to the next, but somehow they do. Here you can see, this is one of, it's called Aluaudia. It's a very spiny succulent. And so very often also in the dry season, the leaves, the trees drop the leaves. And orchids still grow epiphytically in these areas, but they're really tough and hard in their texture. So the leaves, basically they're really like the trees and like the other plants, succulents. And they probably grow better in a cactus greenhouse than really in a humid, moist greenhouse. So this is also important to know if you get a barbophyllum, because this is a barbophyllum. I mean, it can come from so different habitats, and if you don't match it up with the right conditions, they wouldn't grow. So I think it's very important to consider where the plants come from. Many of these dry forest trees, like this Brachybodium here, have spectacular flowers. Really beautiful. So here's some examples of the orchids. No moss on the trees. Here and there are some lichens, and very often the bulbs are flattened and really attached to the bark so that they don't stick out, and I think it's also protection from dehydration. Yeah, so it's really interesting to see that, and even for wildlife, each of these different vegetation types have different wildlife. So different lemur species, different geckos, and so on. So it's nice when one does a round trip in Madagascar to see different habitat types. And it's remarkable that such a small island has such a diversity of different habitats and vegetation types. So to finish, this is a vanilla. And many of us know vanilla as, vanilla planifolia, which is used for vanilla beans for desserts. But this is Vanilla perrieri, which is a leafless vanilla, and it grows in dry forests. And so dry forest species really are better cultivated like cacti, and prefer moderate humidity. But I think important is that they really get the heat. So actually I would say in a greenhouse in summertime in St. Louis, those things would do very well. And the only problem is wintertime, one has to heat it a little bit, the greenhouse. So they don't like temperatures below 70 that much. And the far western vegetation of Madagascar is really desert. And it's just succulent, spiny vegetation, very similar to California or places where you get Arizona, where you get this type of vegetation. There are no more. There are still orchids, actually, but only terrestrial species. And very often they go dormant and come out only during the rainy season. All right. Thank you very much. It was an overview of Madagascar. And I hope I inspired you a little bit about growing some of these species. They're really beautiful and worthwhile to have. And there are many species which are not difficult to cultivate. So, yes?
When would be, if you wanted to visit and be able to see orchids blooming, when would be the best time?
I would think around November, December. I mean, so there's different guilds of species. Some flower at the onset of the rainy season and some towards the end of the rainy season. There's still species which also flower in the dry season, but the majority actually flower at the onset of the rainy season, which would be autumn or fall, yeah.
What type of pollinators do they have there compared to this time?
Yeah, what's very special about Madagascar is that many of the orchids are pollinated by moths. And there are hawk moths. There's a very interesting story. The Ancrecum sesquipedale was seen by Darwin. And the flower has a spur this long. And Darwin predicted that the orchid needs to be pollinated by a moth which has a tongue that long. And people thought he's absolutely crazy. Because why would there be a moth with such a tongue? I mean, so something like this doesn't exist. But then a couple of decades later, the moth was found. And it's called Xanthopan morgani predictor because Darwin predicted it and he found the moth. And yes, the moth has a tongue like this long and it pollinates that orchid. And so that's very special about Malagasy orchids that there are so many moth-pollinated species. There are also bees and flies. So many of the Barbophyllum species are pollinated by flies, which is very similar to other parts of the world. Like in Asia, many of the Barbophyllum species are also pollinated by different kinds of flies. But really spectacular and special are those big white flowers pollinated by moths. Yes?
You had some terrestrial orchids on there?
Yes.
Are those ones also still going dormant too, or are those more evergreen because it's that wet?
You get both. In the humid eastern part, some of the species are evergreen. In the highlands, depending on where you are, for example, on rocky outcrops, they go dormant and then they resprout in the rainy season. So you get all kinds of different types. There's another genus which I haven't shown, Eulofia, or in Madagascar it was long called Oceoclades. Very unusual terrestrial species with very succulent leaves. They're evergreen. So you get succulent evergreen terrestrials and others which basically go dormant or are evergreen with softer leaves. So you can, again, you get all kinds of different types.
One of the things you talked about earlier was that the Botanical Gardens doesn't ship a lot of these plants outside of Madagascar.
No.
They're just sent off to get classified for people. Is there any effort that's going on with documenting them so we could display it like here to show what conservation efforts are actually doing outside of that?
You mean, sorry, I didn't get the question.
Is there any like documentation or showing like the photographs of the plants and things like that to show what efforts the
Yes.
Botanical Gardens is putting out in Madagascar?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could give another talk just about the gardens programs. I mean, there are 10,000s of photos from our program. And I think what's important is the program really empowers Malagasy people to look after their natural heritage. And it's inappropriate for us to send out living plants to other parts of the world. And even we wouldn't get a permit for this anyway. So in terms of conservation, it's all done locally and organized by local people under the guidance of some scientists from St. Louis or from Europe. So it's important to really think about Malagasy orchids as, things which should be propagated in different parts of the world, and they're readily available in the trade. It's not like that we need to export any more from Madagascar. And for description and documentation, usually specimens are made, either alcohol specimens or herbarium specimens of dried plants. We do still ship those over for reference and as a reference collection, because if you describe a new species, you need to have a reference specimen for long-term reference. So in other words, some of the specimens the garden has in the herbarium are hundreds of years old.
I was also asking too, are you guys doing any sort of like displays around too, where people could come through and see the Madagascar orchids and some of the conservation efforts both on site, but then also I believe you guys have a website as well that people can go to.
Yeah, there is mobot.mg, which is the Madagascar website of the program. Our 11 protected areas, each of the sites has what we call the field gene bank, which is a collection of endangered tree species. And very often on the endangered trees, there was orchids mounted. So it's like a mini botanical garden attached to the protected area. And of course, they can be visited and worthwhile the trip there. And lots of orchids can be seen at the protected areas as well. The shade houses are not open to the public in principle because, local people like to steal them, I have to say. And not only local people, I mean, a lot of people like to steal these orchids because some of these species fetch a high price. And so, I mean, this is part of the problem still. When you drive and travel in Madagascar along the roadside, local people still would sell orchids to cars passing by. And very often they're sort of collected and then somehow shipped out of the country or whatever. So it's still a big problem, the illegal trade in Madagascar. That's why the garden is not involved in any export or whatever of living plants. Yes?
So you said something, 160,000 acres that the garden have adopted in Madagascar. This is, I'm not being cynical, but just like, there's a lot of competition within other, the countries, other countries wanting to be involved in conservation. So who else are in, like other country like Europe, or New York Botanical Garden, also be involved in conserving these orchid or plant or succulent, so.
Yes.
This is about competition.
No, it's not about competition. It's about collaboration. And we work with many different other botanic gardens and organizations around the world because there are too many issues which need to be addressed in terms of conservation. So it's really important to collaborate and work with partners. So for example, in Madagascar, we have a lot of international collaborators like Kew Gardens. New York has some programs. So different botanic gardens around the world have programs, but we also work with environmental organizations like Nature Conservancy or Conservation International, the Wildlife Conservation Society. So it's really an international effort to support Madagascar in their efforts to protect the last remaining 5% of the vegetation and to reforest some areas which have been lost in the past. And it's really sort of a partnership between international organizations and the Malagasy government. And our program is actually all about capacity building and education. So the idea is that we do not want to manage the protected areas for perpetuity. So why would a US organization run protected areas in Madagascar forever? This is not the idea. So the idea is really to train local people that they can look after the protected areas in the future themselves. So actually initially we had 12 sites. One site was actually handed over to a local Malagasy NGO who now runs the protected area. Still, like, they come to our office and to the meetings and we still work together with them, but the idea is really to hand these over and do not manage them forever. So it's almost like a training and capacity building program for nature reserve management. And it's a team effort, a collaborative effort.
I'd love to hear that international collaboration, But these, the 160,000 acre, is it adopted or just like, in your gardens or just like, I don't know, just like.
Well, it's not adopted. So it's basically the Malagasy government authorized us to manage the protected area on the behalf of Malagasy people. But we do this not ourselves. We work with local people in Madagascar. So it's actually community conservation. So we empower the local communities which live around the area to look after their protected area, which is a very different approach to, let's say, a national park where you have a headquarter and then some rangers. We don't have any rangers in that way. We have community facilitators which work with the local community and teach them how can you use the forest sustainably without cutting all the trees down and removing all the orchids. So it's all about really training and building capacity with the local communities so that they can look after the last remaining natural vegetation. Yes?
We had talked earlier, we want to start traveling and going and visiting some of these places. In Madagascar specifically, do you know of any programs that are organized, or it's more on a case-by-case basis, assembling your own tour to go up and see some of these sites?
Yeah, there's a number, I think, of tour operators which would offer tours in Madagascar. I'm not quite sure about orchid tours, but I think there was the Orchid Conservation Alliance. They offer tours to different parts of the world just for orchids. And I think there was one tour for Madagascar as far as I can recall.
Well, we're on track. Thank you. It's a great.
Thank you.
I appreciate you coming out here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.